Section 14.1, Voting Methods. Let's start with an example. We're voting for the Honor Society president. 4 students are running for president: Antoine, Betty, Camille, and Don. The club members were asked to rank all the candidates. The resulting preference table for this election is shown in the table on the next slide. And this is what we call a preference table, and across the top you'll see the number of votes cast. To get the total number of votes cast in an election, you would add up those 5 numbers. And then what the columns show you is the preference given. So 19 people selected Betty as first place or first choice, Antoine as second, Camille as third, and Don as fourth, and so forth among the columns. So 3 questions. How many students voted? How many students selected a particular order, C, A, B, D, and how many students selected C, Camille, as their first choice? So to find out how many students voted, you're going to add up the numbers in the top row, which is labeled the number of votes. And we see here there were 54 total votes. Now, for the second question, it wanted to know how many people selected the candidates in the preference C, A, B, D, and we see that's in the second column, and there were 15 people that selected that order. And then finally, we want to find out how many people selected Camille as their first choice. So we look across the table and we see there are 15 votes in the second column, and we see 2 votes in the last column, so 15 plus 2 gives us 17. And here's an example of you creating a preference table given the vote. And so the candidates were asked, or the voters were asked to rank the preferences for 3 candidates, A, B, and C, and here are the preferences shown in this display here, and we want to go ahead and tabulate how many choices or how many people selected first the order A, B, C. So we look and we count among the 16 outcomes, and we see there were 6. And then we want to know how many selected B, C, A, and if we go up there and count, we'll find out there were 4. And then finally, we want to know how many people selected C, B, and A, and if you go up there and count, you'll see there are 6. And you always want to make sure that the totals that you come up with here match the total number of votes cast, which in this case was 16. The plurality method is the most commonly used method for an election. And basically what it says is whoever gets every bit of voter votes for one candidate, and whoever gets the most votes wins. Different from majority. Now, majority means that you've gotten 50% plus 1 of the votes cast, but in plurality, the candidate who gets the most votes is the winner. So consider the Honor Society election that we worked out earlier. Who's elected the president using plurality? So when you use plurality on the preference table, you're only going to look at the first row. And so you want to tally up and see how many votes did people get. So Antoine had 7, Betty had 19, Don had 11, and remember we had Camille there was 17. And so who has the most votes? Betty. So Betty would be elected president using the plurality method. She got 35% of the first place votes or first choice votes, but not a majority. 4 candidates running for a vacant seat on the city council receive votes as follows, and there's 4 vote counts given. They are determined whether any candidate earns a majority and determine who wins using plurality. So is there a candidate who gets a majority? So let's first of all calculate the total number of votes. And if you add those 4 vote counts up, you get 5282. So a majority would be 50% of that plus 1, which calculates out to be 2642. And we see the highest vote count was 2218. So candidate Callow does not win by a majority, but he does win by a plurality and actually received 42% of the total votes. And here's a preference table, and the administration has asked a group of student leaders to vote on aspects of college life to target for improvement over the next year. And there were 4 choices: housing, library, theater, and fitness. Which option is selected using the plurality method? So again, we're only going to look at the first row of the preference table. And we see that housing has 16 plus 9, 25 votes. The library has 27 votes. Theater has 11 plus 5 votes, 16 votes. And fitness had no first choice votes. So the winner by plurality is the library. Did it get a majority? The total votes cast, if we tally up the totals at the top of the columns, we come up with 68. And the library did not have a majority, but it did win by plurality. In the Borda count method, you do rank the candidates from most favorable to least favorable. The last place vote is awarded 1 point, next to last place 2 points, and so forth, all the way up through all the candidates. And then you go ahead and calculate the points that each candidate receives. Whoever has the most points wins the election. So we're going to use the Borda count method for the Honor Society election that we looked at earlier. And so let's take a look at, we have 4 candidates. So first place is going to be worth 4 points, second place 3 points, third place 2 points, and fourth place 1 point. So let's take a look at Antoine. Antoine had 7 first place votes, so that gives him 7 times 4, 28 points. Antoine had a lot of second place votes. He had 34 second place votes. 34 times 3 gives him 102 points. He has 13 third place votes, and they're worth 2 points each, so that's 26 points. He doesn't have any last place choices, so his total, if we add up 28 plus 102 plus 26, we get 156 points. Now let's go on to Betty. Remember, she won by plurality, so she's got 19 first place votes, which are each worth 4 points. She has no second place votes or third place votes, but then she has 35 fourth place votes, and those are worth 1 point. So she has a total of 111 points. So right now, Antoine has more points than Betty. Let's look at Camille. Camille has 17 first place votes that are worth 4 points each, or 68 points. She has 11 second place selections, and those are worth 3 points for 33. For fourth place, or third place rather, she has 26, which are worth 2 points, and she doesn't have any last place selection, so she's got a total of 153 points. And then finally, Don. Don had 11 first place votes, each worth 4 points, that's 44 points. He had 9 second place votes, which are worth 3 points, that gives him 27. He has 15 third place, which are worth 2 points, that gives him 30. And he has 19 fourth place, which are each worth 1 point. And if we add those up, he has 120 points. So Antoine, with 156 points, receives the most points using Borda count and is declared the winner. Plurality with elimination. Each voter votes for one candidate. If a candidate receives a majority of the votes, we're done. That's the winner. If no candidate receives a majority, we eliminate the candidate with the least number of votes and hold another election. If there's a tie for the fewest votes, eliminate all candidates tied for the fewest votes. Repeat the process until a candidate receives a majority. So we're going to use this plurality with elimination on the Honor Society preference table. So the first place votes, we had 7 for Antoine, 9 for Betty, 17 for Camille, and 11 for Don. So remember, we're going to eliminate the person with the least number of votes. Nobody had a majority, so we're going to eliminate Antoine because he had the least number of first place votes. Now, because we have a preference table, we don't actually have to do another election. What we're going to do is just eliminate Antoine from the preference table. And let's go back till I get to it. And basically what we've done is take Antoine out of every location in here, and so we end up now with only first choice, second choice, and third choice among 3 candidates. Now we do the same thing. We look at the first choice votes here. We've got Betty still having 19, Camille having 17, and Don having 18. And so who are we going to eliminate? Do we have a majority here? Nobody has a majority, so we're going to eliminate Camille. So now the first place votes. Now, interestingly enough, Don has moved up here and actually has more first place votes now, so he is declared the winner using plurality with elimination. And the last method we're going to study is called pairwise comparison. You rank the voters, and then a series of comparisons in which each candidate is compared with each of the other candidates follows. If a candidate A is preferred to candidate B, A gets a point. If B is preferred, B gets a point. If they tie, each gets a half a point. After making all the comparisons, the candidate receiving the most points is declared the winner. The number of comparisons seen needed to be made using the pairwise comparison method when there are n candidates is given by this formula, n times n minus 1 over 2. So we're going to go back to the Honor Society example, and we're going to use pairwise comparison. We have 4 candidates, so how many comparisons do we have to make? We're going to use our formula. 4 times 3 is 12, divided by 2 is 6, so we have 6 comparisons we need to make. We're going to do Antoine versus Betty, Antoine versus Camille, Antoine versus Don. Then we're going to do Betty versus Camille, Betty versus Don, and finally Camille versus Don. So let's take a look at Antoine versus Betty. And basically what you do in each column is you look in each of the columns and you see who had the most first place votes, who has more higher level votes basically. So Antoine has a total of 35 votes. Betty has 19 votes. So Antoine got the point. He wins this comparison, and Antoine has 1 point so far. If we now go and compare Antoine to Camille, and I'm going to go back just for a second to explain to you how we're comparing. Let me go back to the comparison table. So we're looking here and we're saying who wins each time. So we're comparing Antoine to Betty. So in this column, Betty wins. Betty has more first choice votes than Antoine. If we look in the second column, Antoine has a higher level of votes than Betty. So Antoine wins this column, and this column, this column, and this column. And that's basically how you do the pairwise comparisons. So let's go on, and we're going to do Antoine versus Camille, and we get Antoine with 26 votes, Camille with 28. So now Camille has a point. And now we're going to do Antoine versus Don, and if you go back and look at the table, Antoine will get 41 votes rather. Don gets 13, so Antoine gets the point. So now Antoine's got 2 points. Now you're going to go Betty versus Camille. Betty has 19. Camille has the rest, so Camille gets a point. Now she's got a second point. And then we go Betty versus Don. Don's going to win this time, like we saw before. Don gets a point now. And lastly, we have Camille versus Don. Camille has 36, Don has 18, so Camille gets a third point. Now there were 6 comparisons altogether, and here's the results. Antoine had 2, Betty had no points, Camille had 3, and Don had 1. So Camille received 3 points, the most, and Camille wins the election. So in tie breaking, if you have an election and there's a tie, you have to figure out how you're going to break the tie. So you could flip a coin, you could bring in another voter. In Robert's Rules of Order, the president of a group votes only to break a tie or to create a tie. The Borda count method, you could choose the person with the most first place votes. Pairwise comparison method could choose the winner of a one-to-one comparison between the 2 candidates tied or involved in the tie. And there's different tie breaking methods that will produce different winners. So it's really important to be fair. The